Hey everybody, another episode of the Well Balanced series. Today I'm super excited to talk to Michael Rutherford, who is my one and only male guest this entire year, so I'm super excited. He is a functional blood chem practitioner and he has a course all about it and educates practitioners about this topic particularly, and is really trying to just shed light on some things that we may have thought were the right way to go with regards to blood work and just root cause healing and where we should probably actually go. So I'm really excited to chat with him today. So I'm going to get him in here. We have some amazing questions that came in as well. So we'll get those hopefully all addressed too and get this party started. So give me one sec. Let's see here. It's not in there yet. Hold on, technology. I wonder if he's even in here. Michael. Let me... One second. I'm going to Instagram message him on my computer. Okay, hold on. We're just hanging out for a second. I forget to tell people it's on live. I think it's just assumed. There we go. Okay. Let's see. There we go.
Hey,
Hey, Michael. I'm sorry about that.
no, you are okay. So I actually have two things scheduled today, and one of them got rescheduled, and I totally thought it was my 11 o'clock time slot. Not, it's
Got it.
totally
No
glad.
problem. Well,
So
I
I'm glad
forget
you said
I
something.
I tend to forget people, like, sometimes they go on Zoom and then I just like they may not read the invitation about like it being on live. So all good. It's super chill. But I am so excited to have you today. Thank you for your time, and this conversation I think is much needed just in this space and just sharing more about what's kind of going on in blood chemistry. People are very, I think, confused and asking a lot of questions. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to use your expertise. Um, so I have a lot of questions that came in as I shared, so we'll kind of work our way through those. But definitely want to start off with just an introduction about you, what got you into blood chemistry, your passion for it, and of course, how you're using the awesome course that you've created to help practitioners and just clients in general.
Yeah. So I have been in this space now for about 7 years in kind of the health and wellness space. And I got here through, like most of us, when we come to holistic health through our own health journey. I've been dealing with IBS since I was about 8 years old or so. So it had been at that point almost 20 years that I had been dealing with IBS. Kind of just at that point was like, this is just my body and how my life is going to be, and
Right.
wasn't really thinking I was ever going to have a change to that. But I was actually over for dinner at my dad's house, and he had been reading some books. And basically, he had made it his goal as he turned 50 to read kind of the top 50 books in health and nutrition that had come out recently, which at that point, we were talking like mid 2010s. So this
Right.
is like 2014, 2015, which is really when we saw like paleo kind of taking off. Keto hadn't really come in yet, but paleo was kind of the real big thing. And so it was a lot of those books that he had been reading, and was just sharing it with me. And I was like, wow, this just kind of makes sense. I grew up in athletes as an athlete and in sports. And so I always just had a general sense of wanting to do healthy things.
Right.
And so I was like, well, this just makes sense to me to eat food that we can grow and raise, that has always been around, that isn't produced in a factory. I'm like, that just kind of seems to make sense. Let's try it. Not thinking it would fix any of my digestion issues. Like I said, I thought that was just how my body was. And I went from having some sort of IBS problem or symptom or issue every, 48 to 72 hours to
Wow.
it had been like a month and I hadn't had anything. And I stopped all of a sudden one day. I was like, wait a minute, and I wasn't even thinking of it day to day. And I was just like, holy cow, like I haven't had a problem in like a month, which is like something has changed. And it was like this, like there's something to this. I have twin boys who are now seven
Aw.
and a half, almost eight. They'll be eight next month. And they were about 6 months old at the time. I was working 70 hours between two jobs and helping with them in the middle of the night. So I was pretty exhausted. I was coffee all morning, soda in the afternoon because I worked in restaurants. I was on my feet, 70 hours a week, 6, 7 days a week. And so I was pretty beat, just run down. But I was finding like my knee pain wasn't as bad. I was taking like 2,000 milligrams of ibuprofen every day,
Wow.
which is 800 over the recommended limit.
You would say that's a
Um,
lot.
so it's a lot. And I might take, 6 to 800 a day at that point. I wasn't drinking, like I was maybe having coffee in the morning, but I wasn't drinking any soda in the afternoon, obviously because I was switching to a paleo diet. And so soda wasn't really on that list of things to
Right.
include. But I also just found that I wasn't needing that energy, like that energy and the sugar and the caffeine and all that either. And so at that point, I was just like, okay, I've got to learn more about this. And when I learn something, it's like an all in. I want to know every detail inside and out. Um, and so here we are, 7.5 years later. I'm still trying to do that.
Hey, I think it's great. There's so much to learn. So I can,
Yeah.
we're never going to stop learning, but I think that's so awesome. So what kind of led you specifically to, again, like the blood chem route?
Yeah, so kind of along this journey of learning, once I've been here, I went through the NTA, I went through the Primal Health
Mhm.
Coach Institute, and started working with clients. And I had a couple really good opportunities that allowed me to see a huge amount of clients, especially early on. I was able to get into a functional medicine practice here locally, where we specialized in cognitive decline. And so
Okay.
we saw a lot of labs. Typically, clients were coming in with about $2,500 to $3,000 worth of labs. It was a lot,
Wow.
because they're dealing with Alzheimer's, early, cognitive decline, and early dementia. And so it's like we need to know everything that's going on like right now so that we can stop this progress and even potentially reverse it. So it took a lot of labs, which meant I got exposed to a lot of labs, and still a lot of that was based in blood chemistry. And we were bringing it all back to blood chemistry because what that really shows us is how the body is responding as a whole system. We get to kind of see that in the blood. And so it's a really unique kind of lens into the body. And then, I left there after an amount of time, and I actually got to work with my dad's company, who is focused in long haul truck drivers, which, if you've ever been to a truck stop, is basically the most unhealthy population career wise that we have in the country. They face every chronic disease at roughly double the rate as the typical American does.
Oh, wow.
So
That's crazy.
yeah, it's really bad. The amount of clients I had who didn't have gallbladders, who had type 2 diabetes, who had metabolic syndrome, were obese, had thyroid issues and autoimmune conditions. It was extreme. It was a lot.
That is
These weren't
crazy.
people who were like, oh, I just kind of feel off and my doctors are saying I'm normal. It's like they've come with diagnosable diseases. The vast majority of my clients did, which meant that they also came with some lab work. And
Mm.
again, it was basic blood labs. So I got exposed at this point. I'm having them constantly bring me their blood labs, like, hey, can you tell me anything else about this? Like, is this helpful? And I was like, I don't know. And so at that point, I was like, well, I don't like saying I don't know. It's not a statement I like to say at all. I will say it
Right.
if I don't, but I don't like to say it. Anyone who knows me knows that. And so I was like, I need to learn about this. And yet again, I'm, about 5 years into learning everything. I've taken probably 3 different courses on blood chemistry. I've spent literally hundreds of hours reading research, reading publications, reading articles that I can on it, and have worked with hundreds and hundreds of clients, seeing those labs and actually applying these things clinically. And the reason why I created my own course was really the holes that I saw in the education system around functional blood chemistry. Is that some courses were really good at covering a lot of markers, but it was very simple. It was like, here's the marker, here's the range, here's a couple of reasons why it might be high and a couple of reasons why it might be low. Then I took this other course, it was by Dr. Brian Walsh over at Metabolic Fitness Pro. Absolutely phenomenal, and really changed my viewpoint around functional medicine as a whole, as well as blood chemistry. Um, and his course did such an amazing job. All of his content does a really good job at explaining the physiology and the why behind these markers and what's happening in the body. But it only covered a really small amount of markers. And I'm like, man, someone needs to take that approach to this approach and put them together and show that kind of depth and understanding to all of these markers that we're looking at in functional medicine. And that was where my mastery course came out.
I love that. I hope to be a student one day, because that sounds really amazing and very beneficial for both the practitioner and the client side. So
yes.
That's awesome. Congratulations. So I guess we'll just dive straight into kind of, I guess, blood chemistry in general. We had a lot of things. And one of the first questions was just common myths and things that you hear, or people that are going to a conventional doctor and getting a blood lab versus maybe doing a functional blood lab. I know you're going to have to be precise on these questions. But, things that just kind of stand out normally. And then also, are blood labs in general as accurate as they claim to be in terms of helping people diagnose, not diagnose necessarily, but figure out what's going on?
Yeah. So let's start with kind of the big one that most people in this space might be familiar with, is the reference ranges, right? So we would think that the reference ranges that the lab uses, the range in which the marker should fall in, right, would be based off of research. They're usually not. They're usually based off of the general population, and they're taking out the massive average and they're getting rid of the worst 5% on the top and the worst 5% on the bottom and saying, okay, what's left? This is kind of the range. That's typically about how they find most of these. You would think it's based off of research, and it's not. So what we try to look for, especially what I really do in my course, some of the reference ranges I use in my course are a little bit different than what are typically taught in functional medicine, because most of functional medicine's reference ranges for blood chemistry actually come back to a single doctor who practiced primarily in the 70s and 80s. And he essentially just based those ranges off of his clinical practice and what he was seeing. My problem with that is there's bias confirmation with any population that you have coming to you. There's going to be a bias confirmation of just like a lot of my clients are super complex and tend to have mold illness. That doesn't mean I think everyone has mold illness, even though the vast majority of my clients do, because that's just my population. And so we have that population bias. And there's not, and the research, the literature doesn't always match up with some of those ranges. Some of them they do, some of them they don't. So what I use is what's called prognostic data. So prognostic essentially means we take this marker and we're going to look at people within the reference range and then follow them for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and see which sections of those ranges had the worst outcomes. Did they have, whether it's all-cause mortality, it's cardiovascular disease, it's diabetes, whatever it may be, cancer risk, whatever it may be, we're going to follow. And so the one in that reference range who had the best outcomes, so the least amount of death, the least amount of diabetes, the least amount of heart disease, that's our optimal range, right? So the people who are in that range had the best outcomes. That means that's where we want to be, right? So we want to be in this narrowed down range. And so that's what a lot of how we actually finding these optimal ranges. And that sometimes is a lot smaller. Sometimes it's minimally smaller. Sometimes it's a lot smaller. And so that then gives us an area. What I call everything that's in between. If we have this, let's use the range, the reference range of 100 to 200, let's say. That's the typical reference range. Ours might be 120 to 160, right? So it's a lot smaller. But if you're at 180, I'm going to say, hey, you're in a dysfunctional area. You're not in that optimal thing. You're not in that optimal zone. We're trending towards, being into diagnostic criteria and disease state, but we're not there yet. If you go to your doctor, they're going to be like, nothing's wrong, right? It's inside that reference range, because what they're using those for is disease, right? They want to label you with a disease. And so they need to wait until you're in a disease state. But we don't go to bed today healthy and wake up tomorrow with type 2 diabetes. Right? There's this long progression, typically over 5 to 10 years previously, that we could begin seeing that disease manifest if we're looking at the right markers in the right way. And so that's really what functional medicine is really focused on, is that gray area. And I kind of call it like the subclinical area, when we're in between those two ranges. You're outside optimal, but you're inside the reference range. We have this subclinical state. And that's where functional medicine shines. And it's why so many of us talk about, and you see the reels and the memes and all the different things about, oh, I went to my doctor, they said all my labs are normal, but I feel like garbage, right? And it's because you're in that subclinical state. Sometimes I have people who have like 15 markers out in that subclinical range. They have a ton of areas that we can improve. So that's the big one.
No, that's so awesome. And I think that, you know, again, it's like, do you want to live in a normal state or an optimal state? And I think that it's just a matter of that there is a difference, and that you absolutely can achieve that. It might take a little bit more sacrifice in some areas, but the fact that we strive to get you in that optimal state is so awesome. So, okay, so then with regards to other testing, you know, like HTMA was brought up along with other labs such as like GI maps, Dutch testing, saliva testing, whatever. Can you explain how blood chem can support those tests and how it's also different from those in other areas?
So this is really simple. This is what I always say. I will never run any of those tests without blood chemistry. I run those tests. I won't run them without blood chemistry alongside. I will run blood chemistry by itself. And usually that's where I start. I love all the other tests and I use them when appropriate. But I think what has happened, and I think this primarily comes from all of the talk about niching, right? You have to niche. You have to know your niche. And the problem is that's a marketing thing. Niching is how we market. It shouldn't be how we practice. But what has happened in this space is that people practice based off of their niche. And so if we don't look at a person as a whole, we've actually become, in functional medicine, in this functional space, the very thing we despised 5-10 years ago about allopathic medicine. It's all the specialists. I remember Chris Kresser, one of his first books, and when he was going on his podcast tours, he would talk about how the problem is you might have skin issues and gut issues and brain fog, and you're going to 3 different doctors for each of those, let alone the entire problem was gluten sensitivity. Right? And it was all this one thing, but you're going to 3 different doctors. Now we're having to do that in functional medicine because you have someone whose focus is just on gut health, and someone who focuses just on hormone health, and someone who's on thyroid, and someone who's on this. And so that gut person is only running a GI map, and that's all they're doing. The hormone person is just running a Dutch, right? And that's all they're doing. And I get the people who have gone to those people and they've run GI map after GI map after GI map, and they still have problems. And we go and look at and I'm like, where are your blood labs? And I'm like, well, I don't have any. I've got all these tests. I'm like, yeah, but do you want to see these? Like, I've got a note and a GI map and a Dutch. And I'm like, okay, but where's your blood labs? And they're like, well, I don't have them. The blood is what connects the whole body. That it is the connective tissue of our entire body. It connects all of our organ systems, and the entire body communicates through the blood. So it's what's giving us this well-rounded picture of how the body is responding. It should be the most run lab in any functional practice, regardless of niche. And yet it's probably one of the least common right now.
That's so interesting. So like, can you kind of break down just like what HTMA would tell you versus what blood chem would tell you, you know, and kind of to the audience?
So, and if there was ever a pairing that I love the most, it's actually those two. I think there's a lot of similarities in what they are telling you, but different ways in which they're telling you. And so we get a whole picture. I always remember this one person, if you just ran her HTMA, you would think that she needed more magnesium, just more and more and more. She was already taking 400 or 500 milligrams a day. But the HTMA was basically saying that she was wasting out magnesium. And so the traditional teaching is that you need more magnesium because you're losing it, right? But when we looked at her blood labs, and what we saw is a whole picture, looking at her sodium, potassium on her HTMA, her magnesium levels, and then looking at how depleted her body was of magnesium in the blood. Her RBC value was low, her serum value was low. And what was happening is that her body couldn't actually get the magnesium into the cells. It was a transport issue. More magnesium wasn't the fix. What actually happened is we cut her dose down to like 200 milligrams from like 400 to 500 a day, cut it down to 200, and worked on the things that would support her transport based off of what we were seeing in the rest of her patterns. And her magnesium levels actually came up on her blood and improved on the HTMA. It started to come down more towards the normal. So this is where, again, having that complete picture of both of those, because they're both showing us different things, can really give us, again, that blood is going to show us how the body is responding as a whole
Mm-hmm.
and what other factors are looking there. And I find over and over again, I see these issues. We can see that again with like a GI map. If we pair that with a GI map, if we have nutrient deficiencies that are causing issues, right? That's not going to show up on a GI map. We have no
Right.
way to see that. And the reason why they're stuck on these things and they can't get off is because of this thing going on a blood chemistry. It's like, whoa, here's your nutrient deficiencies. And this is why you're stuck on this and you keep doing the same protocol because we have this going on. Or a big one, why do I keep getting dysbiosis over and over? You look at your blood labs, look, you have iron overload. So, and sometimes severe, and all you're doing is feeding those pathogens. And so they're just going to keep back because you basically have an all-you-can-eat buffet for your pathogens by having that iron overload in your body. But you can't see that on a GI map.
No, that's so interesting. It's definitely the full package in terms of getting everything if you're able to. But yeah, I love that they all work together and show you things inside the cell, outside the cell. Because I get that question a lot saying, is HTMA beneficial? And I'm always like, if you compare it with blood, it's going to be better. But it's not that you would ever be wrong to do something like that. But like you said, you're going to get more bang for your buck if you can do it all collectively together. So, okay. So with regards, you kind of touched on iron. So I want to just jump in that just very briefly. So I think that's a big topic that people
It
have
is right
questions
now.
on. I see a lot of your reels busting some myths over there. And so like just basic, your thoughts on, the diagnosis of anemia that's been very just prevalent in today's culture. And like you kind of mentioned iron overload. What are you just kind of overall thoughts on that and how that can be supported or, seen through blood chemistry?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to talk about is, and this just becomes the difficulty of social media and especially reels where we have 90 seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then even our caption is limited. We could always go into the comments, but it's like even our caption space is limited.
No one
So
reads
we can
anything.
only get, and so we can only get so deep into the details of what we're actually talking about. And I think the other big thing is that the pro-metabolic space is super big right now, which is where a lot of the like iron overload and anemia and all that stuff is coming from. And that a lot of, I won't say most, I know that a lot of the practitioners who are kind of following into that space and teaching about some of these concepts don't actually use blood labs very much or have never really had a whole lot of teachings on them. And what they don't understand is that there's really two different versions of iron overload. We have iron overload in the blood, but that's going to look very different potentially than iron overload in the tissues, which is so often what we hear about in the pro-metabolic space of why we need copper and retinol to pull that out, right? Because now all of a sudden we have that iron. If we don't have copper and vitamin A to bind that iron, it won't show up on labs. It's still in our body, but it won't show up on blood labs. So bound iron is what shows up on blood labs, and that's where we need the copper and vitamin A to bind that iron. So if we don't, then it's stored in our tissues, and that will show up oftentimes as anemia because it's not bioavailable to the body. And so you could have iron deficient anemia and have excess iron in the body, right? But how you deal with that iron overload is very different than iron overload in the blood. Those are going to be two different ways that we address it and two different causes, right? So there's a lot of different things that are going on, but it gets talked about as if it's all one, and people are getting confused. And I've had people who had iron overload in their tissue but were anemic going to try and donate blood because that's what they heard will get rid of that. And it doesn't, because it's in the tissues. It's not in the blood. It's in your tissue. So donating isn't going to really get that out. So we have to be able to understand those differences. Other the potential causes is like, yes, copper and vitamin A is one. So is parasites. So are heavy periods. So is IBD and malabsorption and infections, not just parasites, but other infections as well. There's a lot of different things that can shut that down. And it's not just, copper and vitamin A is going to fix it, because it may not, you may be inhibiting how much iron your body is even pulling into the body. And so it doesn't matter how much copper and vitamin A you put in there. If there isn't iron to be bound because it's not coming in through your intestines, it doesn't matter. You're just going to have a bunch of copper and vitamin A, and your iron levels aren't going to change. So this comes down to, we have to be able to see those labs to see, is your body actually receptive to iron right now? We can see that in the labs. It's very easy to see. Hey, is this body actually receptive to iron? Sometimes we're deficient and it's not receptive because we have infections and inflammation, and your body is smart and knows that the iron is going to feed the pathogens and feed the inflammation and the oxidative stress. So it doesn't want those in right now. So it actually shuts down that transport.
Wow, that is very interesting. I'm reading the Cure book right now, and he was talking about a lot of that with regards to just iron in the tissues, and it's so fascinating. So I think that is something definitely we could obviously talk for hours on, but okay. And then I think the thyroid is another big one that people have questions about, women specifically, when they go to functional doctors or conventional doctors, whatever, and they're asking for these tests, what do they ask for? How can they feel that they're getting exactly what they need?
Yeah, so this is one I go back and forth on. So, and this is when I might get a lot of heat for. So I understand why conventional doctors only look at TSH and T4, because if we're trying to evaluate the function of the thyroid gland, it's all you need. In fact, actually, really, all you need is T4, because the primary job of the thyroid gland is to produce T4. About 85% of what it's going to output is T4. So it is the best way to assess the function of the thyroid gland. We use that in relationship to the TSH because there can be issues there, but really it is all we need to assess the function of the thyroid gland. The bigger problem, though, is that that's just one form. Glandular hypothyroidism, when the gland isn't producing enough, is just one form of many types of hypothyroidism. So we could have hypothyroidism because the pituitary isn't functioning well, in which there's not enough TSH coming to the thyroid. And so if there's not a lot of TSH, there's not going to be a lot of thyroid hormone output, right? And so that's an issue, not of the thyroid, but of the pituitary. It's not doing its job. But then we have a lot, and this is where I see most people clinically is they have cellular and tissue hypothyroidism. I know you're familiar with that if you use HTMA, right? We see it all the time. The blood looks okay, but when we look at the HTMA, it's like, holy crap, there's no. And sometimes it's good in the blood because it's not getting into the tissue. So that's one issue. And there are other patterns we can see within the blood labs as well. The problem is conventional doctors aren't going to know what to do with those other labs anyways, because they're not educated on that. So I'm always hesitant to tell someone like, go ask your doctor for these labs, because guess what? Doctor's not going to know what to do with them, and you don't know what to do with them. So having the information isn't any good if we don't know how to use it. The best advice is to find a practitioner who does know how to assess those things and what labs to run, because now they are going to run the right labs and they are going to know the labs to run. And it's the biggest question I get all the time is, what lab should I run? What should I do for this? What should I do for that? It's not going to matter, because if I tell you the labs to run, I also have to tell you how to interpret those and what they mean, right? Because without it, it's a pointless tool. It's a pointless information. It might as well be in gibberish, right? It's like we could get all the ancient scripts that we wanted, but if we don't know how to interpret those, we don't know what they were saying. They could have the key to success, the key to everlasting life, and the fountain of youth, map. But if we can't read it, it doesn't do us any good.
No, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think that was another question kind of going into that, where, besides working with somebody online through all these new, spaces from FDNP, NTP, all those things, RWP and everything, is there anywhere that you'd recommend for people to go to get blood work done, or how they can find a trusted source for these types of things, whether it's local, if possible?
Yeah, so you can always check IFM. They have a great directory. It's the Institute of Functional Medicine. Their website is ifm.org. They have a directory on there. And because a lot of that, they primarily educate licensed practitioners, which is always great, because some of those people on there do take insurance. So there's always a possibility. And you can search through that way. Their search filter is really great. You can search by problems and concerns and specialties and location and insurance providers and all sorts of things. So that's always a great place to check. I put a caveat on anything is there are great NTPs and there are not so great NTPs. There are great FDNPs and there are not so great FNTPs, right? There are great IFM practitioners and not so great ones. And that's always just the difficulty of this space is, and that's really any industry, right? I mean, you could go and think that it's a great, someone who's going to remodel your home and think that they're great, and they actually end up
Right.
being terrible, right? And that just becomes the difficulty of anything is how do you vet that? Ideally, it's through people you know. That's why word of mouth is so powerful. Can you actually talk to, not just see, some testimonies on their website, which are great, right? But can you actually talk to someone who has worked with that person? Word of mouth will always be the most powerful thing. It's the most common thing. I get a lot of people who follow me on Instagram, and so that's where a lot of my one-on-one clients come from, is because they see and they see over and over what I talk about, and so I build that trust. And or they were referred by other practitioners or other clients that I've had who are like, yes, like this guy's great. He helped me with XYZ, and it sounds a lot like what you're doing, and so go and check that out. Um, but yeah, it's, Instagram for me, I think is an incredible tool for finding those people, because you actually get to see what they're doing and what their belief is versus trying to have like a 10-minute interview with a practitioner.
Right.
One of the things I would love to be able to build is like a list, an interview list for finding a good practitioner of like questions to like ask them about. Everyone thinks that like those free calls, right, that we all do is just for, just for us to hear about you, but really it should, like, you're hiring us,
Right.
right? Like employers don't not ask questions to the potential employees. They're asking all loads of questions like, hey, I'm going to be paying you all this money. I want to know, are you good? We have to understand that healthcare is the same way, right? Like we're hiring that person for our help or for their help, right? So we should be asking them questions. But so often there are, so I let like people, when I have those calls, they're like, I'm so sorry, I've got these questions. I'm like, no, I'm like, it's great. Like you should be like, you're about to pay me hopefully a lot, like a good chunk of money. Like you should be asking these questions. You should be concerned.
Absolutely. And I think it's, like you were saying, kind of shopping around, finding your perfect fit, because we're all here. There are so many people you can choose from, especially now with
Yep.
social media and all this amazing technology we have to do labs virtually and all of that. But still, you have to know where you are and feel it out. So, um, well, I have one final question to end this conversation, which has been awesome. So, just general, maybe like top three do's and don'ts to support blood chemistry that, you know, just can be lifestyle things, vitamins not to do, things to not isolate, whatever it is that you could recommend to the audience.
Oh, that's a tough one.
I'm sure your list is like 100 on each side, but
I mean, I would say the general tenets of health across anything, right? It's like we need to be eating a real whole food, nutrient dense diet. We should be prioritizing sleep, right? We should be trying to reduce stress where we can and increasing our resilience to stress as an individual, because that's really where our power is. Because in today's world, we cannot live a stress free, toxin free life. So we have to make this more resilient, right? So it's
absolutely.
doing those things, lifting heavy weights as best as you can. Obviously, some people might have to work up to that level of exercise depending on where their fatigue is at, but getting to that point, that should be something that we're incorporating. Healthy sunlight exposure. I always put my desk under a window so that I can have like while I'm sitting in an office all day, I can at least get some of that exposure. I open my window even when it's 40 degrees outside. So because the sunrise is like right here. And so when I'm out here,
That's
like
so
I
awesome.
open that up and get that actual sun exposure on my eyes, even if I'm indoors. Those really basic things, doesn't matter what we're trying to do, those have to be in place, whether we have thyroid problems, adrenal problems, gut problems, we've got skin problems, we've got mold illness, we have parasites. These are the kinds of things that have to be in place before we're ever able to actually achieve optimal health.
Love
So I
it.
think that above anything else is going to be the biggest thing.
Foundations are always the way to go, I feel like. Can't
Yep.
go wrong. Well, this is an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time. So if you can just finish by telling everyone where they can find you, how they can support you, how clients can work with you or practitioners, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So the best thing is right here on Instagram. So it's functional underscore blood underscore chemistry. You can also just search my name, Michael Rutherford. But I'm here on Instagram, and my link in the bio has all the links to get to everywhere else.
Okay.
And so that's always the best place. I am super open to DMs on Instagram or comments. I try and respond to everything as best I can. I don't always see the requests that are like in the request, like the secret file.
I know.
I don't know who gets there. Like, especially when it's an actual real person and they end up in that one. I'm like, how did that happen? But I do my best to try and answer those. But yeah, and then like I said, I've got links in there to schedule a free call if you want, or links about my course if you're a practitioner and interested about that as well.